We good? Okay. Okay. Glen was the director of the Center for Capital Studies in New York, which he founded in 1992 to develop insight into the process of capital access and ownership change. He was a faculty member of the University of New York Graduate Center, PhD program in economics, and a senior research associate at the Center for Study of Business Government at Baruch College, City University of New York. He has held the position of faculty fellow at the Rockefeller Institute of Government, director of economic research of the Economic Research Bureau at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, and associate professor of management at Stony Brook Harriman School of Management and Policy. He has also served as chairman of the New York State Network for Economic Research and consulted for corporations and governments on economic policy and strategy. He's the author of 5 books, including Restructuring, Regulation, in Financial Institutions and Beyond Junk Bonds. I should also tell you that Glen has just recently published a couple of articles that I'll make you aware of. One is, and it was, the Wall Street Journal article, Glen, was yesterday. One was yesterday in the Wall Street Journal. Commentary section. So you can look for an article by Glen there. Arguing that the Mideast is improving, economically improving. And then he did a marketplace commentary. What is the date on that one? That was also yesterday. And did a marketplace commentary offering ways to ensure that Asia tsunami aid gets where it is needed. With that clumsy introduction, let me please introduce Dr. Glen Yago, who I'm sure will be much smoother than I right now. Thank you.
It's a very high-tech tie clip.
This is the real deal.
Well, thank you very much, and started off a very interesting discussion. I hope that some of these comments will elucidate it and provide some further illumination, as opposed to that old story about the drunk leaning on the lamppost. Illumination and not just support of some of the ideas that we're trying to deal with today. I think, just reflecting a little bit about some of the things that that Carrie had said, and just and certainly inspired by Peter Drucker's thoughts on these issues, is the notion of wealth. And I think especially in the 21st century, this dichotomy or categorization of the different categories, in a sense, have blended more than in the 20th century. I mean, we certainly see areas where there have been the government function, rather than having been a function, has been just as corporations go into default, we see numerous examples of government default, whether in the provisions of goods and services in the government sector, from the aspects of provision of education to public parks and all sorts of public goods. So we've seen an enormous amount of innovation that's occurred both within government and outside of it to deal with the problem of default in that sector. And in many areas, the nonprofit sector has picked up slack considerably in that area. The question of wealth generation is another category, I think, is also one where the notions and where wealth can be generated and affected also is an interesting one. And you go back to the earliest political economist, and we just lost Robert Heilbronner last week. Sort of very interesting. Those of you that really enjoyed the worldly philosophers and Heilbronner's writings over the years passed away at 85 last week. But he, in terms of reviewing Adam Smith's work and the work on moral sentiments, always dealt with the fact that wealth, it was a term I always like to use this with students, that there was an antonym for wealth. That if you weren't generating wealth, there was the old political economists thought you were generating something else, and that was called ilth. and the notion of wealth is rooted in English, in the English language, into the sense of well-being and all of the attributes of health and wealth and the common weal and all of those earlier terms. So if you're not generating wealth, you're generating a byproduct which is less desirable. I was thinking of, just some other examples before I get into the text here, both the commentary we had on Marketplace this week, just looking at the fact that you're about to have $5 billion hit the shores of Asia. And in fact, today my son is on a naval helicopter on his way to the Aceh province in Indonesia, and with the task command there. It's a very interesting sort of dynamic if you think about it. I mean, obviously, as much money needs to get to those people as fast as possible to deal with the health and with the food and the immediate shelter needs. But beyond that, you're dealing with the question, and it's one of the issues we didn't bring up in that first panel, is the question of transparency within nonprofits, which are absolutely essential in any investment model, right? Because what are we dealing with in finance? We're always dealing with the fancy financial term that we're talking about is that we have to overcome in finance information asymmetries. The disconnect between what you know or what I know. Between being on the inside or the outside of a deal. So have $5 billion start to hit what not only has been the tsunami belt of Asia, but also the corruption belt of Asia is a big problem, I think, for nonprofits and for governments seeking appropriately to keep the money rolling into those countries and to get relief to the people that need it. When in an environment, if you look at this, if we were to try to provide this model where there's a lot of sticky fingers, be those the sticky fingers of the military or some of those governments. We do an opacity index. There's published a Sloan Management Review article back in October on our opacity index, which measures all of these countries, and all of the countries, Indonesia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, India, all in the lower quartile of our opacity index. So in a sense, you go back to incentive structures, you have to structure incentives, whether it be as an investor or a donor or a philanthropist, in some way that you're thinking sensibly to make sure that you're operating and completing your mission. And I think that's really important. I'll tell just one personal story of a charity that I was involved in. It doesn't relate to the Milken Institute, but that I was involved as a founder of with some other friends and family, and we put and donors, we put $3 million to work over the last 2.5 years. I teach over in Israel every year, and it's sort of, Andy was telling his 9/11 story. I'll sort of tell my pre-9/11 story that started in June of 2001, because I'm over there every year, and things started blowing up a lot. As you well know, with the problem of suicide bombers. Suicide bombers are now operative in 25 countries in the world. It's really quite remarkable if you think about it. India, Philippines, Pakistan, Russia, Colombia. You've had 2 suicide bombing attacks, really, and it started at this point. If you think about it from a military standpoint, it's pretty interesting because as a strategic weapon, it was a very low-tech weapon, basically, that had a major shift in the balance of power. In combat, because there's no strategic military advantage that can be accomplished by a suicide bomber, other than in a traditional battlefield situation. But fear established, and fear can be a tremendous factor in terms of, as we saw in Spain, or you see you've seen it in Israel, you've seen it, and you certainly see it every day in Iraq right now. You see it in Russia. You see it in Pakistan, India, Philippines, and Thailand as well, prior to the tsunami, if you follow what goes on in Thailand. In any of these cases, that's been a really interesting case. So what happened was I was teaching over there, and there were some of these suicide bomb attacks. The same son who's on the helicopter today was over visiting me, and then he was in New York on 9/11, and then a few months later, there were some very serious attacks in Passover of 2002 in Netanya. During the Passover Seder, there were a number of 25 people were killed, and so we started a foundation that was focused on a very single purpose of stopping suicide bombers and on detecting explosives in order to save lives. Under the premise, I've worked on the peace process, and other folks have as well, I'm sure, in this room. But that you can't really have any discussions as long as that kind of noise is occurring.